Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar hosted by MindTools with Towards Maturity as our partners. We're going to be talking today to you about bridging the divide, solving the breakdown between learning and development and our learners. I'd like to introduce our speakers. Firstly, myself, Ollie Craddock. I'm the Deputy CEO of MindTools, and most importantly, I'd like to welcome our guest, Laura Overton, who's the CEO and founder of Towards Maturity. In terms of some logistics for the webinar, if you'd like to ask us a question, please use the chat box on the right-hand side. Firstly, if you've got any issues with sound, please kind of use that chat box and let us know that now. And finally, before I hand over to Laura to talk us through some of the recent findings that we've worked together on, why are Towards Maturity and MindTools working together? Ultimately, that's because Towards Maturity and MindTools are really passionate about the same thing. We're really passionate about great learning, and what we really want to do as part of our part of the industry is find and bottle the best practice and share that across the L&D community to further our collective cause. And what do we view that cause as? To ultimately help make our people better. So at that point, I'll hand over to Laura.
Ollie, thank you so much, and welcome everybody to this webinar. We are really excited to be able to share with you insights from over 6,500 learning and development leaders and 10,000 workers in the workplace. And what we were interested in doing is exploring how our staff learn at work and how learning and development professionals actually perceive that process, so that we can understand how we can connect and understand how we can engage with our teams a better way. So one of the things that we found from learning and development leaders is that a key driver for us is that we want to increase learner engagement. We're investing heavily in technology, we're looking at different tools, we're looking at different services and resources, content, different connections with different people, but we are finding that actually only about 26% of us are actually delivering learner engagement or seeing that we're successful. So this is really the heart of our program today. We want to kind of explore that. And before we go on to that in more detail, I'd love to find out from you now, why do you think learner engagement is such a big challenge for learning and development professionals around the globe? I'd love to know your thoughts, and it would be great if you could use the question box at the side of this screen just to put your comments in and to say why you think learner engagement is such a big challenge. Nearly 100% of us in learning and development are saying this is something we really want to improve, and yet despite all of our investment, only a quarter of us are actually doing that. So it'd be great to hear some of your views, some of your comments, just to get your perspective directly through on this. Not enough time, absolutely. I'm getting this a lot, and it's starting to come through quite extensively there. Thanks for the feedback coming through there. The learning and development specialists, Renee is saying that it's stuck in their mode of facilitation. So the way we used to do things isn't connecting generally with those. Time not a priority, says Missy. Learning is so individualized, Michelle says, and we're trying to mass teach instead of personalizing that learning. So the personalization is coming up a lot. Thank you for bringing this in. Busy workload, says Emily, and timing again. And Vivian's a really interesting point, saying the aging workforce is an issue as well. Edward, really interesting, overwhelmed with options. We're completely flooded. There's so many things to learn, and that it's a little bit unclear as to where we should go next. So some of these comments are really, really interesting. Michael's talking about it not being a priority. Yeah, and Mick as well, saying not enough resources to allow people out for training. So connecting with what we are doing for the workforce, we've got a real passion in learning and development to be able to deliver solutions, but there's some real challenges out there. Please keep your comments and questions coming in as we go through this. But it's really clear that this is a challenge that all of us face, and there are different reasons behind it. So what we wanted to do in our research program is to explore that a little bit more. And what we found when we started to work with learning and development leaders who were taking part in the Towards Maturity Health Check. We run an annual health check, it's open at the moment, where we ask learning leaders like yourselves to reflect on your current strategy, to reflect on what you're trying to achieve, where you're looking to go, and what's holding you back, as well as your tactics. So that health check gives us a picture of what's going on and how to improve. And it's really clear that the comments that you're putting through here about not having enough time to training, that staff are resistant, some are reluctant to learn with new technology. Nearly half of us are struggling with that, linking back to your points earlier about different generations in the workforce that are coming through from this group. So we're seeing that there's a real sense that we're struggling with our learners, and they're not necessarily contributing. Yet when we go out to workers themselves, one of the things that we do is uncover the learning landscape in an organisation, understand learner intelligence, not what do they want from learning and development, but how are staff learning what they need to do their job. And this was a fundamental question that we were asking in this report, because we know that learning and development professionals are struggling to connect and to engage. But what are staff doing for themselves? And I think we found with over 10,000 workers of all ages, millennials, older workers, directors, apprentices, those that are in sales, those that are in retail, those that are in project management, those that are in science and manufacturing. We asked the question, how do you learn what you need to do your job? Because the world is constantly changing. And it was very interesting, the range of different things that people are saying that they are doing for themselves and what they find essential or very useful. Connections, social, the ability to connect with managers, connect with mentors, absolutely critical role there that you can see. But we're also seeing as well that the formal learning is important to people. As 52% are saying what they've learned in college has been helpful. 63% are saying what they've been learning in the classroom, but equally as helpful as what we're learning from our job aids, from books, and also from e-learning programs. So it's very clear that when we actually ask that question of our learners, that they are really perhaps a lot more connected than we give them credit for. Now, they say that formal learning still plays an important role, but actually 94% of workers say that they would appreciate the opportunity to be able to learn at their own pace. And yet we find that 27% of learning and development professionals believe that staff are connected and engaged. So there is a start of a communications divide that we're starting to come through. That your own pace, having something at the point of need, is really critical for business leaders and for workers. And yet 80% of them are also saying they know how to get to what they need. They know what they want. It's not a confusion. But when we think about what we're doing in learning and development in terms of the way we're designing, coming back to your point that you made earlier about the way that we're connecting and our old modes of learning, of delivering learning, what we're finding is there's quite a big disconnect. Workers themselves are using some of these new tools, new technologies. They are blending their learning experience. They may not use our jargon, but they're blending different experiences for themselves. And yet, as learning professionals, we're not doing that. In fact, only probably about a quarter starting to say of these different things, these different tools, technologies, e-learning, collaboration, face-to-face, how do we bring that together? Only 23% of us are designing learning solutions. So there's one of the disconnects that we're certainly seeing. We're seeing that there is a communications divide, and there are three areas that we would really like to hone in on today. And in these three areas, we're going to kind of flag up where the disconnect is. But I'm also going to hand back to Ollie as well to say, okay, well, how can we have some practical ideas to close that gap? So one of the disconnects we have is around the right content at the right time. We've already mentioned about the fact that many of our learners are accessing Google search, job aids, useful things just at that point of need. And yet, as learning and development professionals, we're not necessarily delivering that. But the right content at the right time is not just about bite-sized micro learning. It's also about thinking about the individual in a holistic sense. When we look at staff themselves and we say, look, you're already connecting online, you're already doing some of these things. Why? What's motivating you to learn online in your own time, doing your own thing? And it's really interesting here that actually people are investing in themselves, in their careers. They're looking for eligibility to improve promotion. They're looking to become more qualified. 61% are saying, actually, we just want to develop ourselves. And you know what? Those who are directors and managers are even more likely to be motivated by personal development. And yet, when we look at this, a learning and development perspective, actually only 1 in 5 of us believe that we are delivering a service that overall supports the career aspirations of individuals with the way that we're using technology-enabled learning. So it's a very interesting perspective how staff are looking at the right content at the right time, not just in their job role, but also in their careers. And as learning and development professionals, that's not something that we're necessarily hooked into, possibly because we've been asked so regularly to do a course, create an e-learning, do compliance. So I think it's really important for us to start tuning in to the voice of our learners. Another area where we'd like to tune into is about access. And again, staff are actually accessing the things that are relevant to them out of their own time. They're accessing learning at lunchtime, at their desks, and also, most importantly, at the point where they need it most. So that's where we're Googling, that's where we're asking questions, that's where we're going online, that's where we're potentially looking at learning resources that our organisation has made available to us. It's not as though there isn't hunger there to be able to do this. And yet only a third of learning and development professionals actually agree that their staff can actually access that learning in places convenient to them. So I think, again, this whole issue about access, how do we make things frictionless for staff? And that includes the way that we communicate what's available is really important. There's a communications gap here. Our staff aren't ill-equipped. They aren't unable to be able to connect with learning, but often they can't get to what they need at the time that is right. Another area we found was around staff influence. Who influences you to get involved with learning? Typically, online learning, particularly, is the area where we have a problem with staff engagement. Classroom training, absolutely as well. But when we've made so much available to individuals in our organisation, we're really seeing that people are struggling. So when we ask people who's influencing you, only 5% say it's learning and development. And in fact, it's the managers, individuals managers, who are the most likely to be influencing their teams to get involved, to find out, to go away, to learn, to explore. The next highest group, by the way, is their peers. As I say, only 5% of us of learning and development staff are influenced by learning and development. So this is really important for us to understand who is influencing who and how are we engaging and supporting the influencers in this process. So if managers are a really critical influential, are they having a great impact? Are they having a great experience themselves? And are we facilitating that? Well, actually, only about a third of us are modeling what a great online experience actually looks like for line managers. And we're not using technology to either equip managers to do their own job or to equip them to support their teams as they're learning online. So influence is really important. And part of influence is also about motivation and recognition. And what we find with staff is, recognition's really important to them when it comes down to their learning achievements. Whether it's online or not or face-to-face. It's a really critical aspect for staff. And do people know that I'm learning, that I'm growing? Is that celebrated in our organisation? That's important to me. And yet it's not important to learning and development leaders. Only 21% of us actually recognise staff or have programs in place for recognising staff for the contribution that their learning is making to themselves and to the organisation. So these are just a few of the different areas that we've found have kind of been highlighted in this research. There's a big communications divide. There are many more in the report, and at the end we're going to give you an email address where you can just connect to all of the different resources that we're talking about today. But bridging this divide is really critical, and we need to start to find some really pragmatic ways in which we can do that, which is why we're so pleased to kind of partner with MindTools as one of our ambassadors for this research. And I know that, Ollie, I'd like to hand back to you, because I know that you've really started to look at some practical ways to bridge some of these divides. So I'm going to hand back to you now.
Thanks, Laura. That was really interesting. I guess, as Laura said, to move forwards in terms of thinking about the kind of the practical ways that we can start to bridge this divide is where I'm going to take us next. And really what I want to do on that is really looking at specific examples for you to take away, and even afterwards, if you're very welcome to come and ask us questions as a result. Ultimately, what I want to cover off though is there's no single answer, there's no silver bullet for us all, but that's because every organization is different, and there are ways with which I hope you can take things from the 3 examples I've got to really take forward and think about how you could apply that in your own organization. Ultimately, where we often start with clients is we don't want our clients, when we're talking to an L&D department, to think of this on their own. We want clients to think of it and even pull in best practice from other places. And often where we start with them is think about learning with marketing eyes, with a marketing filter on this. It is when you're kind of pushing learning through an organization, whether it be an initiative or trying to build more of a learning culture, it's not about moving people from completely unaware of what's available to them to be advocates in one step. That just isn't possible. It's really about trying to build a thought process of stages from awareness, as you can see here, through discovery and consideration, through to conversion, where people are really starting to use the resources you're providing to them. They start to be delighted by them, and at that point is where you really get success, and you move people into the green stages on this funnel that we talk about with our clients. And that's where you get into loyalty, people becoming influenced within their smaller groups, and eventually becoming advocates. So don't think about it as one step. Think about it as think about it as one big leap, but think about it as small steps where you can start to nudge people along these stages. And depending on where your organization is, depends on where the majority of people would be on this funnel, and there are different things you could do to really start to build momentum and moving people down the funnel. In terms of thinking about those examples, we have talked before at MindTools about the idea of a consumer learner, which is exactly tied in with what Laura's talked about. People now have increased expectations of their employer. We all do ourselves, I'm sure, of what they want, when they want it, and also ultimately who they view as credible advice to receive learning from. So the first area I want to talk about, which Laura talked about, is the kind of idea of the right content at the right time. I'm actually going to talk about a client of ours, which is Randstad. For those of you who may know, Randstad is a global recruitment organization with recruitment brands across the world. For those of you in the US and both in the UK. Their audience, which Laura talked a little bit about, the kind of generational shift, is primarily younger, actually mainly millennial, and therefore brings perhaps even higher expectations into Randstad as an employer. So there's lots of work for them, if you think about it from a marketing perspective, to understand their customer. So in terms of the journey that Randstad went on, they really wanted to go on a journey of building what they called and pushed across their organization a lean learning approach. The idea of this was not to provide a standard approach to every single employee, but to start to move towards personalized learning journeys so people could have access through an ecosystem of learning systems to what they want when they need it. And as Laura described, that's something that's a real driver of people in the way they want to learn now. In terms of the journey specifically with MindTools at Randstad, they started out as a phase 1 with a quiet launch, a kind of an open library, they wanted to just see how people accessed it, see how momentum built, and they started to move it through customized learning journeys, blending it into their wider development programs, and ultimately in the phase we're in now, they wanted to have that continuous engagement through a marketing-based approach. So they really wanted to move in terms of the funnel, people from kind of being aware and discovering things in phase 1 through to now where they want to move people is into the green phases of the funnel, into being delighted, influencers, and then advocates. That's where we want to get them to now. In terms of how that journey has played out, we've actually seen with Randstad that they didn't see the success they wanted in earlier phases, and that's ultimately because they weren't, as they admit, they weren't doing enough work to pull people in and sell them the benefits of what was available to them. So in just giving access initially, that just didn't generate enough conversion and enough people engaging in it. So what they started to do was take a step back and think of it from a marketing perspective, and think about their millennial employees as their customer, thinking about where their customers sit, what channels they operate in. And at that point, that's where they started to move it away from being blended into existing development programs and into a more social, sharing, mobile, and some email marketing based approach to really tap into the fact that their audience was very much driven by smartphones, was looking at their smartphones during the day, and they moved it to a much more mobile approach and a much more social media driven approach. So where that ended up was where we are in phase 4 in the kind of engagement and marketing angle. And that was really where they've seen an incredible amount of success versus previous phases as things really start to ramp up. And so they seen both an increase in terms of utilization, which is up to 6 times what they saw in the earlier phases. But the most interesting thing is the difference in terms of the depth of engagement, how deep people are going into the resources available to them, and how deep their experience is across the resource set, really starting to build a depth of knowledge and a depth of insight. What we've seen is that people versus where they were blending it into wider development programs are going twice as deep as they were at that stage. So they've really seen a fantastic kind of multiples of utilization and engagement across that. Some really interesting learnings there. I can see there's actually a question around depth of engagement come in, and I'll answer that straight away. And that was ultimately what we mean by depth of engagement at MindTools, is we look at whether people are engaging with multiple resources in the same kind of theme and area, really driving in to build a skill set that is deep as they've gone from move from a model of when I need to learn something at a point of need into kind of building that skill that's deeper, and therefore so it's about a depth of engagement in multiple resources. I hope that answers the question. So that's the Randstad story. The kind of the learning from that was really about, they thought about their customer and really thought about how to access their customer and really give them that more personalized experience in terms of what they want at the point they need it, going back to Laura's point of the right content at the right time. Thinking next in terms of influence, and this is something I'm hugely a big believer in, because ultimately people need that safety to learn. They need to feel it's okay to learn, particularly when we're providing them with access to informal resources and pushing them to have more of a self-directed approach to learning. So going back to something Laura showed earlier, that in terms of the difference between how we have been kind of driving L&D initiatives and how learners view things, there is a divide between our perspective on recognition of what people are doing. And we think this is hugely important, a critical area to address. If not, it will always hamper any potential success you see. So one example we want to talk about is the BBC. I'm sure the BBC is an organization you're all aware of. They really wanted to kind of push this principle of it being safe and okay to learn and really build that culture of learning. And they realized the importance of having that reinforced from the most senior people within the organization. So what the BBC set out to do was push that through the idea of a target each week for every individual in the organization. And the target they set people was 53 minutes of learning. That's deliberately under an hour, so it drove those kind of informal moment of need interventions. What they then did with managers and senior people was reinforce this through recognition of those people who achieved that in terms of at the end of a week on a Friday afternoon, kind of almost going around and congratulating and recognizing those people in an open plan office, which really created a conversation from people who weren't as part of that in terms of, well, kind of anything from what is this about, and suddenly there's an awareness there, suddenly driving people to discover things. If you think back to the top levels on that funnel, it really drove conversations, noise, and ultimately an increased number of people at the front end. Another organization, when we shared this best practice, actually took this to another level, and the senior managers actually gave out popcorn every Friday afternoon. So it had that, not only that kind of recognition from senior leaders, but the reward aspect that everybody likes the smell of popcorn on a Friday afternoon. So it was handing that out. Thirdly, I want to talk about friction and reducing that. And and ultimately this kind of, we want to link this to the idea of nudge theory, which I'm sure some of you are aware of. And what's this all about? It's ultimately about that we all have great intentions. We all set New Year's resolutions, and I'm sure the majority of you, like me, don't actually achieve them. And that's ultimately because the best of intentions don't lead to positive behavior or change. What we need to do is have small steps that can make a big difference. And to do that, you need nudges to go through those small steps, and you need to make sure you're celebrating the right behaviors when they happen. So if you think back to the funnel, what we have is a organization that's a media and data firm who has a lot of people who are time poor, they're overwhelmed at work. It's a very fast-paced organization. They are operating on a very kind of instant basis. They are reacting to kind of changes going on in the data. They're getting through all the time. They work on an instant message style culture, and they knew they couldn't cut through this noise. So they needed to find an opportunity to encourage self-directed learning. So what they did was they kind of mapped out what their employees, their daily lives were like, and they found an opportunity on the commute. So, and the majority of their people traveled in on trains, the bus, or metro. So they realized there was an opportunity there in the bridge of the either end of the day to access those people and access an opportunity to help drive and encourage them to learn while they're commuting to work. So what they did was send an SMS to every employee in those commuting hours with a link out to a resource that they were providing. Some of those are Mind Tools. And what they saw was huge increases in the amount of learning taking place in those commuting hours. They really took advantage with a nudge of an opportunity when they'd kind of understood their customer and what their daily life was like to really drive some real learning success. So in terms of now, I'm going to hand back to Laura to really take that forward from those kind of practical examples into to kind of close things out with some of the other thinking that Towards Maturity have been doing.
Thank you so much. And I found those examples absolutely fascinating, because one of the questions that came in is, how do we create that sharing culture, that culture where time is shared, where resources are shared, where ideas are shared, and really just kind of connecting learners with content, with some of those powerful ideas that you've just shared with us, is just one of the things that we've identified in some of our research about becoming that high-performing learning organization. You talked about Randstad, Ollie, there, about them becoming this lean learning organizations which are agile. And what we found over the years is that when we start to address some of these things and more, we start to get better results. Now, through the health check work that we do with organizations, what we find is that we've got a particular health index called the Towards Maturity Index, a little bit like the body mass index, about when we find that then the Towards Maturity Index goes up, then the number of benefits, including learner engagement, efficiency, right the way through to speed to competency and business agility and innovation, absolutely increases. And the number of barriers to learning in an organization, the amount of resistance, also goes down. So we're finding that these top performing teams are bridging the gap. And your question, Damien, about creating a shared culture, these organizations are creating a shared culture. They're definitely linking in on those tips that Ollie's just mentioned, but they're creating that entire people experience. They're creating clarity of purpose, an environment where people become continually engaged. And what we find in our top performing teams and learning organizations in the Tools Maturity Health Check is that they are 3 times as likely to be reporting business growth, business productivity, and also profit. So it's not just about learning engagement, but the top performing teams are also 2.5 times likely compared with the average of the rest of our sample to report that staff are also more engaged and are less reluctant. So these top performing teams are really doing that, and they're doing small changes, picking up on what Ollie said in the last moment, that make a big difference. They're listening. It was really interesting in your last example, Ollie, where you talked about proactively understanding how and where our teams are learning. If it's on the commute, how do we adjust? And this is where our learner intelligence work that we do at Towards Maturity starts to really kick in. Listening and being proactive. Only 26% of us are doing this. And to really start to think, how are we harnessing the tools and technologies to create that culture? Again, coming back to the question that was asked, that we're building our own skills in learning and development, and actually 7 out of 10 of the high performance teams are likely to have those skills that they need to create those pathways and to do that nudging that actually, Ollie, you were talking about. And they're also twice as likely to be encouraging collaboration, encouraging sharing of content, etc. as well. So small changes, big difference that we're actually seeing those top performing teams. How do we get there? It's difficult to be able to pick off one thing and start to do it. So that's part of the health check process. And obviously, as a part of this is webinar today, we'd like to invite you to take part in the health check. When was the last time you invested an hour in reflecting on your own learning strategy in complete confidentiality? What that will allow us to do is give you a dashboard of insights to say, okay, well, where are you now against some of these factors that we've talked about and more? And where do you need to be? And how do you bridge that gap? So we'd like to encourage you to be able to do that. But in terms of the takeaways that we found in working together, some really exciting things that we'd like to leave you with. That staff are starting to be more consumer-led when it comes to their learner. We talk about having a customer-activated learning strategy. It's really important in the context of learning. We need to tune into that. It creates the most incredible opportunity for us that we've never had in learning and development before. I've been in this field for over 30 years now, and right now, this moment of technology-enabled work and life balance gives us as learning and development an incredible opportunity. Often we perceive that there's more of a problem than there is. So we need to just give ourselves a sense check, and that's where insights, that's where data can help you and your team. That's why we created this report, to help you to do that. But we need to understand that as learning and development professionals, we've got a real opportunity to deliver competitive advantage. And we need to be intentional about our changes that we have put in place. So we're coming towards the end now, and we'd like to give you this email address. It's only available today, where we curated not only the report, but case studies linked to the health check and more. So if you email this email address now, you'll automatically be sent back all of the links to the resources and ideas that we've facilitated in this report, because the research is just one aspect. As analysts, we're here to help you to move forward, to take those steps, and working with our ambassadors like MindTools means that we can work collectively to take that small change that makes a big difference. So the small change you'd like to encourage you to do is email, get the resources, get started, get going. And with that, I will hand back to you, Ollie, to close us out.
Thanks, Laura. Really appreciate that. We hope everyone enjoyed the webinar. We've run out of time, but we will make sure we go through the questions and get back in touch with everybody to kind of start a conversation around those, because there's been some really fantastic questions come through. So once again, thank you for attending. If you have any questions that you think off the back of some of the kind of examples I've given from some of the work MindTools have done with clients that you'd be interested to hear more about MindTools, then please get in touch with us in these methods. We'll be sending through these charts to you as well. And also, as Laura said, I'd really recommend doing the health check from Towards Maturity. It's definitely something that really adds value to your organization, and that's why as an ambassador we really want to support it. So once again, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day and look forward to speaking to you soon.